Welcome back. This is lecture 2, part 2 now, as planned instead of my mistake. And hopefully there won't be a part 3 necessary due to my mistakes. Anyway, I left off with the slide on John the 22nd, Papal Imperial Conflict, John the 22nd in Lewis, Bavaria. And I had already talked about Clement V, who had moved the papacy to Avignon. In doing so, it's often been claimed that Clement was simply the puppet of Philip IV, but that's not quite the case. Now, before I get further into all of this, I should say that I mentioned in terms of time and why I took a break. This lecture, I think, is really important. It's not that the other lectures aren't, but even though there's only like 4 PowerPoint slides to get through the material so we really understand the dynamics of what was going on is going to be so important that I'm going to ask your patience. And so in terms of this week, the lecture time will be overtime. If we think about it as analogous to an in-person class, we have 2 lectures a week of an hour and 15 minutes, so there should be 2.5 hours of lecture a week, something like this. This may be a bit more. If it is, my apologies. But we'll go from there, and I will try to keep aware that maybe next week I'll try to make sure that the lectures don't go over time, and so we'll kind of make up your time next week, I hope, with the lectures. Anyway, that being said, with Clement V, it's okay. I'm here near France. I can also keep an eye on France. I mean, he wasn't just a puppet of Philip IV, even though he's often portrayed that way. And he said, we need to figure out this problem, this princely problem. And one of the issues is King of Naples and the empire. So Clement said, okay, you know what? Robert was King of Naples, Robert of Anjou, King of Naples. As papal vicar, because Robert of Anjou, I think I mentioned this in previous lectures, not part 1 of here, but I think first lecture of this week. The King of Naples was the papal vicar, like the military arm of the papacy from Papal States. This gets into complex Italian politics between the Guelph and the Ghibelline, with the Ghibelline being the imperial faction and the Guelph being the papal faction. So Robert was the head of the Guelph party, supporting the papacy. The Guelphs, or the Ghibellines, were also kind of divided between the blacks and the whites, and it gets really complex and really messed up. But that's kind of the situation in Italy. I mean, if you know anything about Italian politics, even today they are so confused and messed up. It's not even funny. And in some ways, they've always been that way, at least since the breakup of Rome. And so, what we're doing is saying, okay, Clement, I'm going to get together with the papal vicar, Robert, and we're going to come up with a plan. Because the papacy had really taken a hit because of Boniface. So, what we need to do is to say, okay, how do we handle such things in the future going forward? And we need a plan. And one of the things we should do, we can deal with the King of France, but the Emperor is more of a problem. Especially because the Emperor at the time now was a man by the name of Henry VII. And Henry VII was causing problems. Because Henry VII wanted to reclaim authority and power over northern Italy, not all of Italy, which he said was traditionally part of the empire. Northern Italy consisted of a number of city-states, independent city-states, imperial city-states, Ghibelline, in other words, but yet very independent. And Henry VII said, I need to reassert my authority and rule over northern Italy, extending at least down to the Papal States. And so what are we going to do about this? And so Clement and Robert, seeing this potential threat on the horizon, said, okay, what we're going to do is once Henry VII dies, we're going to get rid of the office of the Holy Roman Emperor. Just think about that for a second. That's a big deal. We're going to get rid of the office of Holy Roman Emperor. We're going to get rid of the emperor of the empire because the Pope, you Clement, are head of it all anyway. So they'll solve the problem. Just get rid of your opposition, the Holy Roman Emperor, not in the person of Henry as such, but the office itself, the position itself. And how we're going to do that? We are going to prevent another imperial election. Now, as I said before, both the emperor and the pope were elected offices. I mean, the office and institution was there, but the people who to fulfill those offices were elected to those offices. So if we will just prevent another election, imperial election, there won't be a Holy Roman Emperor. We'll forget about it and we'll just go our merry way. Now, that is plan A. If that won't work, we move to plan B. Plan B is if we can't prevent another election, we will insist and make sure that the emperor must come to the Pope to be crowned as emperor, thereby placing the emperor clearly underneath the power of the papacy. Now that goes back to Charlemagne. As Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope, he wasn't aware that he was going to be crowned by the Pope. It was a surprise, and he wasn't all that thrilled with it because it seemed to set the precedence that the Pope was the person who makes the emperor the emperor. So that whole dynamic in terms of the relationship between emperor and Pope was important. Whereas the imperial idea is, I'm already emperor, I'm already part of God's anointed. I don't need the blessing of the Pope. Whereas the Pope is like, the emperor is God's anointed, and who does the anointing here on earth? Christ's vicar, me. So we're going to insist that the emperor for legitimacy has to be crowned and anointed by the papacy, by the Pope, if we cannot prevent an election to do away with the office altogether. So that was the plan they had established. We have those documents. That was there. All well and good. But there was a problem. Henry VII was, as I said, threatening the North, and Henry said also, I'm going to look at things in Italy. And that damn Robert. He may be king of Naples, but you know what? He's also Duke of Anjou. And Anjou is a French duchy. He has not done homage to me for his duchy. That goes back to that feudal law system, as I talked about in the basic structures of Christendom, whereby the legal ideal of feudal law, going back to the 12th century, the codification of law, was that a vassal had to do homage to the Lord, that ritualized act whereby the Lord would grant his vassal the fief. That was loyalty, mutual obligations and rights, very ritualized, symbolic, quasi-religious ceremony. It's not just inheritance, even if it is dynastic and tradition that a duke or a count or a king, that their heir would be the next person in line, would receive an inheritance, but yet they would have to be sanctioned by their overlord. That was the theory within the empire. That was the theory all along, all the way down. And Henry said, I got it, because Robert has never done homage. So I'm going to call Robert to court to do homage for his duchy. And Henry announces that. And Robert's like, you got to be kidding me. I'm king of Naples. I'm king. I'm papal vicar. You expect me to go do homage to you? Hell no, I'm not going to do that. Whereby, when that became clear to Henry, Henry said, okay, if If you refuse to come to court and do homage to me, you are therefore, according to feudal law, a rebellious vassal. A rebellious vassal is illegitimate, and therefore your lands are forfeit, and anyone will do a good deed for, and I will reward greatly if you can bring me the head of Robert of Anjou on a platter, if I don't get there first. And Henry invades Italy. So this is great. I can enforce this. I can reclaim Naples for me. Not reclaim, I mean, as if he didn't really have any actual claim on Naples, but this way he could gain Naples too, and he had been reasserted his authority in the north. So he could really put the squeeze on the Papal States and the papacy. Robert says, to you. But then Henry does invade, crosses the Alps with his army, starts marching south. And Robert starts getting worried. Okay, I'm king of Naples. I have, substantial resources, but can I really defeat the emperor in open war? Not sure. So Robert's sweating. And this is one of those great serendipitous events in history, or by chance. As Henry's moving south, gets near Rome, and camps on the outskirts of Rome, and dies. Yeah, divine judgment, maybe. Henry was camped in a bed of malaria. Malaria had been an ongoing problem. This is in 1314. It had been an ongoing problem for the first couple of decades of the 14th century anyway, in Rome. Hot summers, mosquitoes, malaria, which they didn't really know about. And Henry and his army camped in a bed of malaria, and he died. I don't know how many of his soldiers died as well, but Henry died. So Robert is all of a sudden like, whew, dodged that bullet, number one. Number two, thank God the emperor is dead. We can effect our plan, Clement. We can put into effect plan A, prevent another imperial election. Problem was, Clement died. 1314. All of a sudden, there's a papal vacancy and an imperial vacancy. There's no pope. There's no emperor. What the hell do we do? And plan A certainly was not going to come about. The imperial electors got together and they elected Frederick. Problem was, as all elections, it's very political. There was a group of electors who said, we were coerced to vote for Frederick. We didn't really want to vote for Frederick. So we're going to meet again and elect the emperor, which they do, and they elect Louis, Duke of Bavaria. Split elections, we will see, have very negative consequences. Compromises, as we will see, have very negative consequences. Problem. So who's emperor? Is it Louis or is it Frederick? Louis proclaims himself emperor. Frederick is like, not really, but I don't really have world pretensions. I'm just happy to be in Australia. They end up later on having skirmishes, and Louis emerges victorious. For this early period, it's almost a tacit agreement that, fine, Frederick, you can play emperor there in Austria. I'll be emperor everywhere else. Starts acting as emperor. Meanwhile, the College of Cardinals, get together to elect the Pope, and they cannot come up with a solution. Who should be Pope? the factionalism was there. We can't really decide. It's almost as bad as the Republicans trying to elect the Speaker of the House. Um, Sorry for that, but couldn't resist. But this papal vacancy went on for 2 years. Everybody in Europe starts writing letters to the College of Cardinals saying, please elect a pope. We are without a head. We're a body without a head. How does that work? How can we possibly function as a church without a head of the church? We need a pope. Robert of Anjou finally weighed in. All kinds of suggestions were being made. He finally wrote to the cardinal and said, I'll tell you what, I have a solution for you, a compromise. How about electing Jacques de Coeur, Archbishop of Avignon? He's old already. He's like, I think he was almost already 80 at the time. He won't last long. He's a great guy. He had been my court chaplain in Naples before he was appointed as Archbishop of Avignon. And the colonel said, not bad, okay. Why not? So they finally, 1316, elected Jacques de Coeur as Pope, and Jacques took the name of John, and he was the 22nd John to be Pope. John the 22nd was a crusty old man, and the cardinals had no idea what they were getting themselves into. He was a canon lawyer, as Boniface had been. He was as astute, if not more astute, as a politician than Boniface. And he set out to put the church in order. Did a number of things. Number one, he then put Plan B into action, saying that there's no emperor right now. There's a split election to begin with. Louis, you're walking around pretending to be emperor, but you're not. And so John starts writing letters to Louis, Duke of Bavaria, who's pretending to be emperor, which really upset Louis. He responds, writing to Jacques de Coeur, who's pretending to be pope. Same kind of interaction with Gregory VII, Pope Gregory VII and Henry IV back in the 11th century. This is more vicious. What do? Even got worse because John's looking around. He realizes there's a problem. The problem is with these Franciscans. John the 22nd was trying to firm up and not just establish, because it's been established, but support and build and grow papal supremacy. That was his point. He reissues Unum Sanctum, and he establishes the papacy at Avignon on a permanent basis. He moves all of the papal offices to Avignon, whereas Clement just did it as a temporary solution. The popes had been, other places. The Pope is like the emperor. The Pope is the ruler, the spiritual ruler of the entire world. The Pope can live anywhere he wants. And at times, the emperor would, same idea. The emperor often lived in Vienna, or Ravenna was an imperial city. Pavia was an imperial city, as we'll see. So it wasn't set to any particular location. And John said, I can live anywhere I want as Pope. And Avignon is a good place. John the 22nd started building the papal palace in Avignon, which is still there today, and entrenching the papacy in Avignon. Also causing more problems. As I'll talk about later, Augustinus of Ancona, who's writing for John, we'll get there when we get there, pointed out that, as Pope, you can live anywhere, but the Pope is also the Bishop of Rome. And as bishop, you need to be in Rome, because a non-resident bishop is a heresy, or problem, the fallacy that's been condemned, going back to the freedom of the church. That was one of the things that Gregory VII had done. So bishops must live in their diocese. So you're contravening church law by not living in Rome as bishop. But as pope, you can live anywhere. Now, I'll come back to that issue with Augustinus of Ancona later in this lecture. But these Franciscans, if I'm supreme, there's a problem. Why? Because the Franciscans were portraying themselves as leading the most perfect Christian life because they were imitating Christ literally based on the poverty of Christ. Naked and poor, following the naked and poor Christ. Not owning anything, as I said. So, wait a minute. If that were the case, that means any little Franciscan would be more perfect than I am. I'm not a Franciscan. That can't be, because the papacy, the Pope, is the most perfect Christian of all. Papal hierarchy, that's the whole basis of it. And they are basing their claims on this myth that Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus owned nothing. John says, that's wrong. The fact that Christ and the apostles owned nothing is a heretical statement. Why? Just one example. When Jesus is about to go into Jerusalem for his passion, what does he do? He sends a couple of his disciples, he's going to town. He'll find a house there. There's an ass tied up, a donkey, an ass tied up. You tell the owner, bring me the ass. I'm going to write it in. And if the owner asks you, what are you doing? Say, the Lord needs it. Now, John argued, either Jesus stole that donkey or he owned it. Jesus is Lord of all. Jesus owns everything. And who's the vicar of Christ? I am. So to claim that Christ and the apostles own nothing is an heretical statement. And John, in 1323, in his bull Cum Inter Nullos, condemns the statement that Christ and the apostles own no property as heretical, which thereby condemned and proclaimed as heretical the very foundation of the Franciscan ideal. This sent shockwaves to the Franciscan order and others as well, because all of a sudden it's like, what? We can say, oh, isn't this just kind of a minor dispute of religious or spiritual people? It's like, no, this is central to the whole political situation, as we'll see as I unfold this story. The Franciscans, in response, said, wait a minute, no, that's not the case. Because we know that we are the most perfect form of Christian life. And Pope Nicholas III, in his bull, Ex Eat, of 1231, proclaimed us as the most perfect form of religious life already in 1231. What do we do? There are various factions. Some of the Franciscans were in complete opposition to John the 22nd. The leadership of the order, Michael of Cesena, was the prior general of the order. He was trying to work out some kind of a solution and compromise. They're called the Michaelists. Not really knowing what to do. And Louis of Bavaria saw this as an opportunity. He already was very upset with John the 22nd. So if we can join forces with the Franciscans, maybe we can get something done. How do you deal with a debate over the papacy? You call for a church council. Louis, in 1324, issued a decree. He was in the city of Sachsenhausen at the time, so it's referred to as the Sachsenhausen Appeal, calling for the princes of the empire to get together, anybody else who wants to come, to hold John the 22nd accountable for making the claims that he was above Louis. Now, in this document, 1324, Sachsenhausen Appeal, there's a section of the text that scholars have referred to as the Franciscan insert. Textual analysis has shown that it was written separately from the rest of the Sachsenhausen Appeal and inserted into the document. And that this section was written by a Franciscan, we're not sure whom. There have been different attempts to identify or try to identify who was the author of this Franciscan insert. None of them have been conclusive, even though they've been maybe certainly persuasive, but possibly, but not sufficient evidence to say this person actually wrote it. Bonegrazio Bergamo is a very likely candidate. Another possible candidate potentially was William of Ockham, who was a theologian, a Franciscan theologian, and was also writing against John the 22nd politically. And William of Ockham was going to have major influence, as we'll see later on. He's one of the great minds of the later Middle Ages, a brilliant logician, a brilliant theologian, and all kinds of things about Ockham that we could be talking about. But he also stood in opposition to John the 22nd. This probably wasn't Ockham who wrote this Franciscan insert. It may have been Bonegrazio Bergamo, who was part of the Michaelists, the leaders around Michael of Cesena. Probably was not Michael of Cesena because it was a radical Franciscan version. So it might have been called what's called the spiritual Franciscans, which was the Franciscans who were very much against John wholeheartedly in rebellion against John. And so Michael of Cesena had to try to balance how to keep the spirituals in line and yet still defend the rights of the order and privileges of the order. It was a difficult balancing act. And Bonegrazio was kind of bridged the spirituals and the Michaelists together. Anyway, we don't know who wrote it. Number one. Number two, it's irrelevant. No, it's not irrelevant on one level, because if we could identify who definitively who wrote it, that would be a help. But the point being is, at the time, they weren't debating that. This is a debate of scholars, modern scholars trying to figure it out. This so-called Franciscan insert didn't come with a title. It's not like the Sachsenhausen Appeal, and we have that document. It's not like the Sachsenhausen Appeal all of a sudden says, oh, insert, Franciscan insert. Okay, back to me, Louis of Bavaria. It's an imperial document. It's one whole imperial document. And what does this section of the text that scholars have identified as a Franciscan insert say? It argues as follows. John the 22nd has condemned the statement that Christ and the apostles own no property, thereby condemning the assertion that the Franciscans lead the most perfect form of Christian life. Yet, John's predecessor, Nicholas III, in his bull Exii, 1231, had already proclaimed the Franciscan ideal, the Franciscan life, as the highest and most perfect form of Christian life. Because a pope, in matters of faith and morals, is infallible. John the 22nd has condemned an infallible decree. Only one thing or being could do something like that. That's the Antichrist. Because an infallible decree is a decree of Christ himself. And John the 22nd had condemned Christ's decree through Nicholas III. Ergo, John the 22nd is the Antichrist. Whoa. It's pretty big. John the 22nd, when he got this copy of this Sachsenhausen Appeal, is the scholar who put this all together. This is not me. I've done a lot in this area with the Augustinians, which we'll talk more about, but this part of it is Brian Tierney. He was a scholar of canon law, medieval canon law at Cornell. Brilliant mind. Himself a Catholic. Got himself into a lot of trouble with this book. Because what he argued was, this is the first time in canon law that we see an argument for papal infallibility. no precedent to argue for papal infallibility. And it was put forward by a Franciscan, probably an heretical Franciscan, because the spiritual Franciscans, John too condemned, proclaimed as heretical. So it's probably coming from this heretical Franciscan group arguing for papal infallibility. And why? It served their cause. And what Tierney argued is that John probably laughed at this when he saw it. It's like, that's ridiculous. He was a brilliant canon lawyer. He knew that there was no precedence for papal infallibility, but he couldn't completely ignore it because it was put out within an imperial decree, the Sachsenhausen appeal. For John, it's like, hell no, I'm not infallible. My predecessors, my bozo predecessors, aren't infallible. I'm not infallible. I'm supreme. Papal supremacy is far better than papal infallibility because that means I'm limited to the idiots who've come before me. If they're infallible, what ridiculous nonsense. I'm supreme as Pope. Now, papal infallibility, as you may or may not know, was proclaimed official doctrine at Vatican I in 1870. Much debated at the time, should they or should they not. It's a long story in terms of the aftermath thereafter. But at the time, this was a novel idea, and John thought it was ridiculous, but he couldn't ignore it because it was come out in a papal decree. What do we do? We need to go to war with John, or with Louis. And Louis says we need to go to war with the Pope. There's a problem. Moreover, also in 1324, same year as the Sachsenhausen appeal, another treatise appeared by a scholar who had studied in Paris, studied medicine in Paris, liberal arts and medicine, named Marsilius of Padua. And his treatise was called the Defensor Pacis, or the Defender of the Peace. Now, Marsilius was supported by Louis of Bavaria. And Marsilius's Defensor Pacis was the most radical document of political theory in the Middle Ages. Because what Marsilius argued was that the papacy should be abolished. You're going to get some of the drifts. This plan of Clement V and Robert of Anjou was basically that we should abolish the Holy Roman Emperor. Marsilius now is saying we should abolish the papacy. Because Marsilius, and he's been so misunderstood, he's been seen as just this rather pure Aristotelian, quote unquote. Well, that's not what he was at all. Does he base a lot of his theories on Aristotle? Yeah, but everybody did at the time. What he's doing is saying, okay, what is the basis of authority? We know from Scripture that the powers that be are ordained of God. There's nothing in Scripture that says that the powers that be that are ordained of God are only Christian powers that be. Government and authority is a divine institution, even if led by non-Christians, led by infidels, led by pagans. Rome, the Emperor of Rome, before they became Christian, was still the asserted authority. What does Jesus say? Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. We can live, and Christians can live within a non-Christian state. Because authority and power is not based on Christianity. But to live well, we cannot. We have to be in a Christian state because Christianity, we know, is the true religion, and the only true religion. So this distinction between living and living well was made. So in a state that is a Christian state, you have to be Christian. In a non-Christian state, we have Christians. We still need a priesthood, not only a Christian priesthood, but the infidel state will have a priesthood of the wrong religion, because the priesthood is an essential function of the state, as it was in Rome. Roman priesthood. But the hierarchy of the ecclesiastical hierarchy is a human institution. The clergy is a divine institution, but the hierarchy, the structure of it, is a human institution, and therefore we can get rid of it. There's a human institution devised by the emperor, going all the way back to Constantine, recognizing the papacy and so forth. It's not necessary. The function of the state is to govern society, and the function of a Christian state is to govern Christian society for living well. There are roles necessary for a state: police roles, garbage men, collectors, etc., teachers, and on we go. But if you don't have these functions, you're not going to have a well-run state of any type. And the clergy, the priesthood, is part of one of those offices. It's just like the police force or the garbage collectors. Same thing. But how it's organized is a human determination. What runs a state is what Marsilius referred to as the legislator. The legislator was not necessarily the emperor at all. Marsilius really kind of had the ideal of the northern Italian city-states, republics in mind. Some of the republics, some were not republics, but that gets into another issues. But this abstract concept of the legislator, the person who gives the laws, legislator, handing over the laws, determining the laws, was not identified with a given office or person. You could, in a republic, you'd have a legislator. In a monarchy, you'd have a legislator. Now, Marsilius dedicates his Defensor Pacis to Lewis and basically says, you are the legislator. But basically, where that authority and power comes from is from the communio civium, the community of citizens. Grant that power, the coercive power, to the functioning legislator. I guess kind of complex and abstract. But that power is kind of from almost popular sovereignty, but it rises to a legislator who has the authority to make sure the laws are enforced, because coercive force is necessary. That's clear. And only with the legislator being able to do that can we have peace. Why do we not have peace? Because of the interference of the papacy in temporal affairs. They're sticking their nose in where there's no business doing so. Therefore, we should get rid of that office. Not get rid of the priesthood. We're not. This is not a theological, as such, overturning of Christianity in any way, shape, or form. Marsilius was a convinced, committed Christian. He said the institution of the papacy has to go. And he also used the Franciscan argument in terms of the papacy is condemning Christ, because Marsilius argues Christ was naked and poor. And here we have the Pope living in bishops, living in luxury. They're living as princes. They shouldn't be. They're hypocrites. It's a very extensive argument. And it's often portrayed as Marsilius as that's a treatise of kind of an Aristotelian theory of the state. And I said, no, it's not. It's actually a treatise of ecclesiology, of what the church should look like, because Marsilius, as everybody defined the church as the communio fidelium. And when you have a Christian state, the communio fidelium, or the communion of the faithful, is one and the same as the communio civium, the communion of the citizens. What Marsilius was arguing for was a state church, as opposed to the papal model of being a church state. Lewis thought was great. Lewis invaded Rome, or invaded Italy. In 1328, Marsilius went with him. They went to Rome, and they proclaimed John the 22nd deposed. John, of course, was in Avignon, and they elected a new pope, Nicholas V. There was some support for Nicholas, but not all that much. because John went on the counteroffensive and launches mercenaries against Lewis. He's fighting. I think I already mentioned that it's been estimated that he spent like 2/3 of his income fighting Lewis in Bavaria, because he had been hit with this kind of two-barrel shotgun. The Sachsenhausen Appeal, 1324, and Marsilius Apache's Defensor Pacis, 1324. He needed a response, and he got a response from the Augustinians to provide the theoretical structure for the counteroffensive, so to speak, just as Boniface VIII had gotten support from Giles of Rome and James of Viterbo. And Augustinus of Ancona, Augustinian hermit who was chaplain in Naples, wrote his Summa de Ecclesiastica Potestate Ecclesiastica, Summa de summation, a comprehensive treatment of ecclesiastical power. This is the most extensive treatise on papal supremacy, the papal hierarchical theory, as it's called, that had ever been written before and since. It has never been translated. There's been parts of it that have been selected out and translated. It's never been translated. It has never been edited. That's the problem too we have with all these sources. He's mentioned sort of. There's a book, one book focusing on Augustinus of Ancona, also known as Augustinus Triumphus, but it doesn't really get him right, and it doesn't get Marsilius right. Anyway, we go on from there. I talk about this somewhat in the Luther book later on. Augustinus was trying to probe the extent of papal power. How far could it go? Also, as a warning to John. Now, I told you, he said, that as a pope, he could live anywhere. But as Bishop of Rome, Augustinus argued the Pope necessarily was required to reside in Rome as a shepherd of his flock. Now, he sent that to John. John's in Avignon, but John didn't really pay much attention to those warnings. Another example he used, Augustinus of Ancona did, was, can the Pope empty purgatory? Could the Pope empty purgatory? Just proclaimed by fiat, boink, all souls in purgatory are now in heaven. And Augustinus said, yes, the Pope could do that. Why? Because the Pope has all the power of Christ. Problem is, he doesn't have all the knowledge of Christ. So if the Pope were to empty purgatory, he could do so. But if he did, he would err. It would be his salvation that was at stake. So by doing so, by emptying purgatory, basically the Pope is condemning himself to hell. In other words, he doesn't say that explicitly, but that's the implications there. And that too, he's telling John, yes, John, you have all the power of Christ. Which John's like, I knew it. Great. I thought so. I knew it. It doesn't necessarily pay attention to that warning part. But if you use it like that, you're going to be answerable to it and it could get you condemned. Augustinus also then explicitly asked the question, is the Pope infallible? Now, Augustinus wrote this in 1326 and sent it to John, dedicated it to John. Where did he come up with the idea of asking the question, is the Pope infallible? The Sachsenhausen Appeal. Does he cite it directly? No. Is there direct textual evidence that Augustinus of Ancona knew the Sachsenhausen Appeal or Marsilius' Defensor Pacis? Some, but little. But he definitely knew it. We know it, and I can prove it, and I have. In my mind, I've proven it. Even though he's not citing, he's not refuting it explicitly. He's standing back from both documents. He's not saying, I'm going to write a refutation of the Sachsenhausen Appeal or of the Defensor Pacis. Actually, another Augustinian did that at John the 22nd's request. William of Cremona, the prior general of the order, wrote a treatise condemning the Defensor Pacis in a series of 5 points that John had extracted, saying, please, can you refute these? He said, yes, here you go. I'll get back to that in a second. But Augustinus is like, this is the overarching structure. How far can we go, John? So he asked the question, is the Pope infallible? And Augustinus said, yes, the Pope is infallible as long as he doesn't err. So it's like an infallible decree is one that's infallible, but if it's a mistake, it's not infallible. So we have a fallible, infallible Pope with Augustinus of Ancona. Like, how does that fit in his mind? It does for Augustinus, but it takes kind of work to get in there. Can there be bad popes? Augustinus asks that directly. He says, yes, they can. And there have been bad popes. Are Christians required to follow bad popes? Augustinus says, yes. No one can judge the Pope except for God. And John, beware, God will judge you for what you do. Now, there's one exception to that following a bad pope. You have to follow a bad pope. Unless the pope commands something heretical. If the pope were to command that you must always wear pink on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, that's a ridiculous, stupid command, but Christians would have to follow it. Complain about it all they want. Is it from a bad pope? Yes, that's only a bad pope can make such a stupid ass kind of decree or something analogous. But Christians would have to follow it. The pope would be answerable to God for that, so that when the pope would die, go before the judgment seat of Christ, and Christ would say, why the hell did you do that? What were you thinking? It'd be sinful. It'd be wrong. But Christians have to follow, unless the Pope's heretical. If the Pope said Christians, you have to spit on Christ. When you go into worship, into church for Mass, you don't say Mass. You go up to the altar and you spit in Christ's face. If the Pope were to say something like that, you do not follow that decree. You're in opposition to it. Because then the Pope is clearly and openly in heresy and therefore is no longer Pope, by definition. But where that line is difficult. You have to follow bad popes to the point of heresy. And basically, Louis of Bavaria, you may think what you want about John, but he's not a heretic like that. So you have to follow him and obey. That was the uptick of it all. And it'll all come out in the wash, so to speak, in terms of the Pope's judgment, because no man can judge the Pope. Emperor cannot judge the Pope. Only God can judge the Pope. That was a solution. It's a brilliant treatise. Very long, very extensive. Never been edited. Very few people have read very much of it, if any of it. It's mentioned as just another treatise supporting papal hierocratic theory, which has never really been treated, in my mind, correctly, i.e. historically, getting into the context of what I've been talking about here in the first part of this lecture, to see what the dynamics that were going on and what's at stake. These issues. Who can judge a pope? How do we determine if there's a conflict? What to do about it? Calling for a council, as Louis of Bavaria had in the Sachsenhausen appeal. What do we do about all this? These were the issues that would continue to cause problems. They had come to the fore. There's no real solution. There's a crisis of authority. When you have two competing authorities, how do you solve it? So there's tensions all along. But here, in between 1300, let's say 1294 with Boniface, and 1328 to 30 with Louis of Bavaria and John the 22nd, they had come to the fore and become such cataclysmic conflicts. So all of a sudden, it's like something is not right here. There is a fissure, and somehow the power that's supposed to all work together is not working at all. John the 22nd is sending troops in to fight against the imperial troops, which is the Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman Emperor is proclaimed an anti-pope. So how did it all resolve itself? It really didn't. Except the North Italian cities, who were supposedly Ghibelline and pro-emperor, John had already excommunicated them based on their adherence to the imperial position. When Louis comes in, sets up camp in the north, they finally realize, you know what, the emperor is not any better of an overlord than the pope is, actually. We want to get him the hell out of here. So they revolt against the emperor. The papal forces, Naples forces, resist the emperor, and Louis in 1330 goes back north of the Alps, back to Bavaria, back to Munich. Marsilius of Padua goes with him, as does then the Michael of Cesena, and William of Ockham. They flee to Louis's court. Ockham continues writing against John the 22nd, but the military threat was over. John had quote unquote won, because John just continued to live on. I think he dies in 1333. I'm not quite sure if that's the correct date off the top of my head or not. I have to check it out. But he was very old. He was a crusty, feisty old man. Anyway. And there began to be some sort of a healing process, sort of supposedly. And then what hit? Plague. What hit? The 100 Years' War was going on anyway. The famine had already hit. And Christendom is beginning to crumble at the foundation and at the seams. It's like, what is going on? How do we deal with this problem and this conflict of authority that seemingly has no outcome? Unless we go Marsilius's route, or thoroughly the papal route. So either we have to go completely church-state theocracy, or completely state-church with no papacy, no hierarchy, the emperor, the princes. There was a problem with Marsilius because Louis was very pleased by Marsilius, of course, effectively working against John. There's an inherent problem with Marsilius. For him, the legislator was not embodied in the office or the person of the emperor. It could also be in a republic. It was based on the communio civium, the community of the citizenry. And the legislator then was the kind of representative power of that. It basically set up representative bodies. And if I am King of England, do I want to say that the seat of authority, the legislator, is in the representative body? No, it's in me. I'm it. King of France, same thing. It undermined monarchy, even if it was theoretically possible to support it, as it was with Louis of Bavaria, proclaiming him as functioning as the defender of the peace. Marsilius' defender of the peace, did not catch on, aside from the immediate conflict between Louis and John the 22nd, and then Augustinus of Ancona's response, and William of Cremona's refutation of Defensor Pacis, the 5 Articles, until much later, the court of Henry VIII. We'll get there when we get there on that. Now, John the 22nd, what did he do? He was so pleased with what William of Cremona had done in terms of refuting the articles that not only did he take word for word from William's treatise for his official condemnation of the Defensor Pacis in 1328, he also named him a bishop. Another Augustinian had written for John, not nearly as good, but still important. He made him a bishop. Augustinus of Ancona already had a very prized position. So what did John do for William, or for Augustinus? He sent him 100 golden florins. He said, I will provide you an annual salary of 10 gold florins if you continue writing books for me. And John the 22nd also did something with William. He granted William's request because William didn't want to be bishop. So like John said, okay, what can I do for you then? He said, I'll tell you what you can do for me. Right now, the order, the Augustinian order, which we've supported the Pope since Boniface VIII, we really should be in custody of Augustine's tomb in Pavia, should we not? He's our father, our founder. And John the 22nd said, yeah. In 1327 already, John issues the bull Veneranda Sanctorum, which proclaims the Augustinian hermits the true sons and heirs of their father, leader, teacher, and head, St. Augustine, and therefore should have custody of Augustine's tomb in Pavia. And I'll be talking about that whole dynamic in the next lecture on the Augustinian Renaissance. But that's the context that kind of came out of, and what was going on. And all these religious theological issues were not simply religious and theological. They're also very thoroughly political and very intensely so, with military force and might behind them all, as it's all going together, one and the same thing, which makes sense when we're talking about Christendom, which is a religio-political entity. And religion and theology is not simply a matter of individual choice. It's not a matter of individual taste. It is policy of the territory. That we need to grasp to understand what's coming as we develop throughout the 14th century and the 15th century and beyond. We'll continue with this, but this sets a foundation for this Reformation of the later Middle Ages, because things are falling apart completely. What do we do about it? Thank you for your patience. Bye-bye.